A recent report from ADAM data shows that foreclosure activity in the first quarter of 2023 rose 6% from just the previous quarter and is up 22% from Q1 of 2022. These are, of course, pretty concerning sounding numbers. So today I'm going to dive into the latest foreclosure data to determine if there is a foreclosure crisis brewing in the United States. This week, we're going to dive into foreclosure data and see if the housing market is vulnerable to another foreclosure crisis, just like the one we saw back in the Great Recession and the years following that. First things first, when we look at this, we have to just look at the most recent data, and I am pulling this from a company called ATTOM Data, ATTOM. They're a very large and reliable data source for this type of information, and this is where I'm getting most of my information here. In the report they just released, it showed that in Q1 of 2023, a total of 95,712 properties in the country had a foreclosure filing. This is up 6% from just the previous quarter of Q4 of 2022, and it's up 22% from the previous year, which is a big growth rate. In March alone, there was over 36,000 filings, which was up 20% from just the previous month. So that is huge. And it is also the 23rd consecutive month with a year-over-year increase in foreclosure activity. And the numbers I just cited were any properties with foreclosure filings. But as you probably know, foreclosures, like the whole process, can take a really long time. So it's actually helpful to look at the individual stages of foreclosure data. I also have two more data points for you: foreclosure starts and then actual repossessions. So when we look at foreclosure starts, which is basically just homes entering the beginning of the foreclosure process, as of Q1, starts were up to over 65,000, which is up 3% from the previous quarter. Not crazy. It's less than the filing number we were just talking about, but it is up 29% year over year, which is really, really big. In terms of actual foreclosures, this is where the lender actually repossesses the home. There's no way that they work it out. The lender goes in and repossesses the home. Only about 12,500 homes were repossessed in Q1, but that was up again. It was up 8% from the previous quarter and 6% from the previous year. However you look at it, any of these three data sets, foreclosure activity is definitely on the rise. But that does not mean that the US is facing a foreclosure crisis. And this is a perfect example of why when you look at data, really most any data, it is really helpful to zoom out to get the full context of the situation. Because in this instance, if you look at foreclosure activity over the last 15, 20 years, I have data back to 2005 from ATTOM, foreclosure activity is still incredibly low. And yes, it is low even despite the fact that foreclosure activity has been rising. Remember, I said that in Q1, roughly 100,000 properties had foreclosure filings, and that might sound like a huge number, but for context, pre-pandemic back in 2019, that number was about 150,000 to 175,000, depending on the quarter, so it is still well below that number. And then if you look all the way back to the Great Recession, that number was huge. It was over 900,000. So yeah, foreclosure filings are up, but in 2009 and 2010, they were nearly 10 times higher than they are today. And that was foreclosure filings, but the same thing goes for foreclosure starts. Foreclosure starts are now at around 65K, like we talked about, but they were closer to 100K pre-pandemic back in 2019, and they were above 500K during the peak of the housing crisis in 2009, 2010. So this is really important information and context. Although foreclosures are rising, and they are rising at a fast rate year over year, they are still lower than they were pre-pandemic, and they are way lower than they were in the years following the Great Recession. So in historic terms, foreclosures are still really low. And you may be wondering, how can this happen? How can foreclosures be growing quickly on one hand, but also be really low? Well, that mostly has to do with the pandemic and the government's response to it. As we all know, the government put a foreclosure moratorium in place, and the mortgage industry worked with the government to together implement a really pretty robust forbearance program that kept a lot of people out of foreclosure. So these two things combined, the forbearance program and the moratorium, combined to make foreclosures extremely low from 2020 to 2022. And it is probably artificially low, right? It is lower than it naturally would have been had there been no pandemic and no government intervention. We saw foreclosure filings get below 50,000 for context during those years, which is just really, really insanely low by any historical context. But now that those programs are over, the foreclosure process is open again, and homeowners who are in default are entering the system just like they normally would as of a few years ago. So the reason, again, that we're seeing this large and scary sounding growth rate, like 22% year over year, is because foreclosure numbers are returning gradually to a more normal level after being artificially low for several years. It is not, at least right now, because there is this huge glut of foreclosures hitting the market in any sort of historical context. Foreclosure activity is down pretty much across the board in a historical context. So even when you account for the long time period it takes to foreclose, activity is down. We just saw that starts are still below pre-pandemic levels, and they're about 1/10 of where they were after the Great Recession. That gives you a sense of where we are today. Foreclosures are ticking back up to normal levels, but currently there is no sign that we are entering, at least right now, a period of high foreclosures by any historical standard. That said, we have to look forward a little bit, right? Well, that's just where we are today. If we look forward, this is just my personal opinion, I do think foreclosures are going to tick up a bit from here. When you just look at the macroeconomic climate, you see that unemployment filings, they're still relatively low, but they are starting to pick up. And the general consensus among experts is that the U.S. is going to experience more job losses in the coming months. So unemployment is expected to go up. We also see other forms of consumer debt like credit cards and auto loans also reaching concerning levels, and default rates for those are starting to go up. And we're seeing that inflation is destroying spending power. And all of these things combined just could lead to an increase in foreclosures. And personally, I do think that they're going to go up a bit. But that said, I don't think we're on the verge of any type of foreclosure crisis. I don't really see any evidence right now that we are going to see foreclosures go up past where they were in the couple of years leading up to the pandemic. Let's say 2017 to 2019 is probably where they'll go over the next couple of years. And no one was exactly talking about a foreclosure crisis in 2017, 18, or 19. When you look at the data, mortgage defaults are just very low. The vast majority of Americans are currently paying their mortgages as agreed. Additionally, the average homeowner has about $170,000 of equity in their home. That is incredible, and it is a record. Meaning, if the average homeowner loses their job, for example, and they can't make payments, they might have to sell their home, but they're not going to sell it at a loss. They're probably just going to put it on the normal market and actually turn a profit. They're not going to be foreclosed on. There just aren't that many houses in the US that are underwater right now, which basically means the house is worth less than they owe on their mortgage. That is just not really happening, even though home prices have been declining on a national basis since June. There was just so much appreciation in the housing market in the last few years that even with declining prices, homeowners are still in a very good position, generally speaking. Everything that I've been talking about so far has been on a national basis, but if you watch me regularly, we always talk about how regional housing markets are really where you get valuable information. So let's look at the top and bottom 10 states for foreclosure rates. And we're talking, the way we measure foreclosure rates is what percentage of total homes available in that state have experienced a foreclosure filing. The number one highest rate of foreclosure activity is in Illinois, where 1 in 762 properties has experienced a foreclosure filing. Number 2 is Delaware, then New Jersey, Maryland, Nevada at number 5, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, South Carolina, and Florida at the 10th most common state for foreclosures. When we look at states with the lowest foreclosure rates, they are South Dakota, North Dakota, Vermont, Montana. So those are a lot of sparsely populated places. That's interesting. Then Kentucky, Washington, Kansas, West Virginia, and Idaho. So those have really different levels of foreclosure rates. Remember when I said the highest one, Illinois, is one in every 762 houses experience a foreclosure filing? When you look at the ones that are at the bottom of that list, like South Dakota, it's 1 in every 15,535. So really far in a different direction. And South Dakota is kind of an outlier for extremely low foreclosure rates. When you look at North Dakota, it is 1 in every 7,875, which is still about 1/10 as many foreclosures as you see in Illinois. So there is a really dramatic difference here in what is going on from state to state. Now, that's basically where we stay today, but as we've been talking about during this video, foreclosure rates, generally speaking, are rising. So I also wanted to share with you the top 10 states where foreclosure rates are going up the quickest. And the list is actually pretty different. So if you look at that, Alaska is the fastest growing in terms of foreclosure rate with 192% year over year. So that is really dramatic. Then we have Oregon at 173%, West Virginia, New York, Maryland, Vermont, Idaho, Arkansas, New Mexico, and Wyoming. So those are the states where foreclosures are going up the highest. And I think it's kind of interesting because there is overlap here between the states that have the lowest foreclosure rates and the ones that are going up fastest. So maybe they're sort of catching up. Like states like Idaho and Wyoming made both lists, for example. It's also worth noting that when I was looking at this data, there are 4 states where foreclosure rates are actually declining. That's Maine, where it's gone down 39% year over year, Alabama, where it's dropped 10%, Missouri 7%, and New Jersey at about 4.5%. So that is what's going on a state-by-state basis. If you want to check this out in more detail, I will put a link in the description below to the ATTOM data that I'm using for this analysis. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope this helps ease your mind. Foreclosures are going up. There are a lot of scary headlines about it, but in any sort of historical context, foreclosures are still really low. If you have any thoughts about this episode, any questions about it, you can put them in the comments below, or you can reach out to me on Instagram, where I am at The Data Deli. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next week.